Listen to me, be very careful around strangers when you're in a national forest, especially at night. Case in point, late on Friday, August 13th, 2021, two women drove back into the mountains outside of Moab, Utah after telling their friends about this mysterious man they had met near their campsite. Hell, they'd even given this man a nickname, the Creepy Man, and according to the women, this man was watching them and just getting way too close to their campsite, and that obviously made them extremely uncomfortable. Once the women went back to their camp, their text messages to their friends started to get very dark. Apparently, the Creepy Man was still there, but this time, he had moved even closer. And to make matters even worse, now he was starting to wander around their campsite in complete darkness, and that's when the text messages stopped. And it sounds crazy in hindsight, but at first, no one actually knew whether this silence meant anything. Cell service in these mountains can be very unreliable at times, and Kylin Schulte and Crystal Turner, the two women, had spent much of their lives completely off-grid. 24-year-old Kylin Schulte was born in Vail, Colorado, to her parents, Sean Paul and Valerie. But then she grew up mostly around the towns of Wolf Point and Billings, Montana, and her friends and family always said she was this bright, free soul who tried to stay positive no matter what life threw at her, and honestly, it threw a lot at her. And speaking of that, one thing that I want to throw at you right now is the subscribe button. Well, I guess I can't actually throw that, but I'd be so grateful if you would help me reach our goal of 1 million subscribers. We're so close. And if this is your first time watching, you can hold off from subscribing for now. I'm going to do my absolute best to earn your sub by the end of this video. So there's little public information about this next piece of Kylen's story, but apparently at one point, it seems that she actually had a daughter who ended up passing away shortly after birth. And I want to be extremely careful when talking about such a sensitive topic, but that obviously sounds very, very devastating. And sadly, Kylen would suffer another major loss on May 17th, 2015, when she found out that her younger brother Mackie was accidentally shot and killed by one of his friends. Mackie was only 15 years old. And look, this whole thing was just a misunderstanding apparently, and it turned into a tragedy that completely shattered the family. And Kylen took it especially hard because Mackie wasn't just her little brother, he was her best friend. After this awful tragedy, friends said that Kylen seriously struggled with living in Montana. I mean, there were just so many dark memories there. And so at the end of 2015, she and her father moved to Moab, Utah to kind of start fresh. And that's when she met Crystal Turner. Now, Crystal was born in Hot Springs, Arkansas to her parents, Obie and Beverly Turner. She was 38 years old, and just like Kylen, she also understood loss from a very young age. Her father died in 1988 when she was just a child, and then later in life, she would lose one of her brothers and two of her half-brothers as well. Her mother said that she was tough, independent, and kind of a tomboy growing up, someone who could absolutely hold her own if she really needed to. She loved Harley Davidson motorcycles and presented this rather rugged exterior. I mean, you probably know people like this, right? But I don't want to give you the wrong picture there. At the same time, people constantly talked about how warm and funny she was. And Crystal was also a mother with a son and two daughters from a previous marriage back in Arkansas, but eventually her path led her to Moab, Utah, and again, that's where she ran into Kylen while on a hike, and their love story only heated up from there. By 2019, they were officially together as a couple, and they were pretty much inseparable. They shared this love for the outdoors, they shared a desire to live off-grid, and they also shared in each other's grief, of course. They lived together out of a converted camper van and spent much of their time camping in the desert surrounding Moab. They ended up getting married in 2021, and they just lived this simple van life, you know, often moving from one campsite to another, always staying kind of on the outskirts of town. And over time, the couple became very familiar faces in this small little town. And though it almost seems like they kind of ran away from their old lives and are now living this weird life out in the desert in Moab, I want to be clear, that's not what happened. They were still checking in and speaking to their families on the phone quite regularly. Kylen's father said, for instance, that they never went, more than a few days without making contact, which made it, that much more concerning when no one could get a hold of either one of them on the night of August 13th. You see, that evening, Kylen and Crystal had set up camping in the La Salle Mountains, which is this remote area that's anywhere between like 20 to 30 miles from downtown Moab. And I've actually been to this area before, and so you can trust me when I say that it has no real luxuries or amenities of any kind. It's absolutely beautiful up there. It's an amazing area, but it's not the kind of place where you want something to go wrong. After Kylen wrapped up her shift at the Moonflower Community Co-op, she met up with Crystal at a place called Woody's Tavern. The couple enjoyed a few drinks, and they also caught up with a couple of their other friends there. The group laughed and talked and kind of kept to themselves mostly. Nobody suspicious approached them. Nothing really that noteworthy happened, but like I mentioned at the top of the episode, one particular thing kept coming up all night long. Kylen and Crystal mentioned that the man they called the Creepy Man was camping near them out on LaSalle Loop Road. And look, nicknames are a huge part of the outdoor community, and trust me when I tell you that the Creepy Man is about the last nickname that anyone should ever want to be known by. I mean, there is absolutely no coming back from that, but it 110% sounds like this guy had earned the title. Anyways, the details of their exact interactions with the Creepy Man were pretty vague, but the discomfort behind their words was not. And so once the group finished their drinks, everyone said their goodbyes right around 9:30 p.m., and then Kylen and Crystal drove back out into the wide open desert towards their campsite beneath the dark cliffs and the winding back roads outside of Moab. And one thing I want to note here, probably something that you're wondering about, is that it wasn't clear to me why they went back to that exact campsite, knowing that the Creepy Man was probably still there. If you're familiar with this story and you know why this is the case, please leave a comment, because this drove me crazy the entire time that I was researching, honestly. I mean, maybe they felt committed to that particular spot for some reason. Maybe they already had gear set up there, or maybe they had already paid for it. Maybe it was like a pay site. Whatever the reason, their night was somehow about to get much creepier than it already was. As the night went on and the couple went back to their campsite, they were kind of continuously texting their friends and kind of keeping everyone updated on how their camping trip was going. And at first, the messages seemed very normal, but of course, the conversation ended up taking a strange turn because they wrote that the Creepy Man was back. According to these text messages, this man had suddenly moved his vehicle much closer to Kylen and Crystal, and one text message even described him walking around in the darkness, carrying clothing and food. I even saw one source, and I cannot confirm this, but one source even said that the Creepy Man had started howling at the women through the trees. I don't know if that's true, but clearly the women were becoming extremely uncomfortable with the situation, but at least for a while, they just stayed there and they kept texting with their friends and family. But then, almost out of nowhere, those text messages stopped. There was no explanation. There was no goodbye or good night. It was just silence, total silence. And with that, things are about to get even darker than they've already been. And so before we get there, I do kind of want to just lighten the mood. This is a tough one. I want to lighten the mood, and I want to tell you about Drink Element. So Element is the sponsor of this video, and honestly, they're the reason that I'm even able to tell this story in the first place. And so I've been trying to be a little smarter about caffeine lately, because reaching for more coffee every time that you feel tired can turn into a pretty vicious cycle. You've probably been there. I mean, you have a cup in the morning and then another one in the afternoon, and before long, you're just chasing the crash, essentially. And the problem is that caffeine doesn't actually create energy. It mostly just masks the signal telling you that you're tired. And so when it wears off, all of that fatigue is just waiting for you. And that is exactly why I've been loving Element's new lemonade iced tea, because instead of using the isolated caffeine that you find in a lot of crappy energy drinks, Element uses full black tea extract, which naturally comes with L-theanine and polyphenols. And of course, because it's Element, you're also getting their electrolyte blend of sodium, potassium, and magnesium to support your hydration. The result of all of this is like a noticeably steadier lift, less spike, less drop, and none of the sugar and artificial colors or weird ingredients that you find in a lot of other caffeinated drinks. It's so much better. And right now, if you go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking, you are going to get a free 8-count sample pack of their most popular drink mix flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. And so what I would do is go ahead and place an order for lemonade iced tea, and you're going to get that bonus element as well. This is a fantastic offer. And so one more time, that's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click that link at the top of the description. And okay, it's time to buckle up because I'm not joking. Things are about to get very dark. Now, despite the abrupt end to the text messages that the girls were sharing with their friends and family, this silence didn't really seem all that alarming. After all, it was getting late at the time, and the two women were camping in this remote area where cell service could be unreliable at best. And again, you have to remember that both Kylen and Crystal were known for living this somewhat nomadic lifestyle, and so disappearing off the grid and not responding to texts for a few days wasn't entirely out of character for them. However, as Friday night turned into Saturday, and then Saturday turned into Sunday, this radio silence, this lack of communication started to feel increasingly unusual. And by the morning of Monday, August 16th, people were seriously beginning to worry. Crystal never showed up for her shift at work that day, and when her manager tried to contact her, well, the manager got no response. And then Kylen also failed to appear for work, and that's when friends and family really started to put the pieces together and realize that no one had heard from either Crystal or Kylen since late Friday night. The whole situation had grown into something much more serious than two campers simply spending a few extra days off the grid. Their friends thought back to that fateful night at Woody's Tavern, and one of them even went back through their text messages, and when they did this, they were reminded of a very ominous message from Kylin and Crystal that now had a much darker meaning. The girls literally wrote, quote, "If something happens to us, we were murdered." And so by Monday afternoon, that particular text message no longer sounded like a nervous worst case scenario or some kind of dark joke. It sounded like a literal warning. And just like clockwork, later that very same afternoon, both Kylen Schulte and Crystal Turner were officially reported missing. This was obviously the first step in order to eventually find the women, but investigators immediately ran into a major problem, and that was that no one knew the exact spot where they had been camping. They knew it was somewhere along LaSalle Loop Road, but that didn't exactly narrow it down enough to provide any solid answers. You have to remember that the extended wilderness surrounding Moab is absolutely massive. There's tons of national forests, there's tons of Bureau of Land Management. I mean, this area is made up of countless miles of rugged desert terrain, as well as some high elevation forest. It's got a ton of remote campsites, miles and miles and miles of winding dirt roads, and of course, very isolated backcountry trails. And all that to say is that Kylen and Crystal could have set up camp in so many different spots. And again, because they lived this nomadic van life kind of, lifestyle, well, investigators, they didn't have a permanent residence to search or any other obvious locations that could provide any answers. As 2 more days passed, very little media attention was given to this case, and search efforts remained relatively limited. However, the couple's friends and family knew that they couldn't afford to just sit there and wait around for answers. Time was slipping away, and so they took matters into their own hands, and they started to retrace the women's movements, following up on any leads that they could possibly think of, and desperately searching for clues that might reveal what had happened before, it would be too late. And that brings us to August 18th, 5 days after anyone had heard from Kylen or Crystal, when a family friend named Cindy Sue Hunter decided to search one of the camping areas where she suspected the couple might have been staying. However, before she did this, She actually checked the local McDonald's parking lot where Crystal worked and often parked her silver Ford Econoline van. And it's a good thing that she checked here because, to her surprise, that van was sitting there in the parking lot completely untouched. And then a few hours later, Cindy found herself driving along LaSalle Loop Road while talking on the phone with Kylen's father. They were both running through all of the different scenarios and listing out all of the places that they'd already searched with nothing to show for. But then, as Cindy drove past a place called Whispering Oaks Ranch, she kind of mindlessly gazed out into a break in the trees along the road, and that's when her heart suddenly sank. You see, Cindy saw something. Something that she just knew wasn't meant to be there deep in the woods. And so she pulled over onto this dusty turnaround and she stepped off into the wilderness. She walked just a few steps deeper into the woods towards this mysterious object, and that's when she saw the exact thing that had made her heart skip a beat. It was Kylin and Crystal's silver Kia. Cindy was actually still on the phone with Kylen's father when this happened, and after realizing what she had found, he actually immediately begged her to get out of there. I mean, the campsite around the car looked pretty normal, but clearly there was something off with this whole situation and the vibe and the silence of the area. I mean, they weren't that far from the road, but again, this is a super remote area, and there was no sign that anyone had even been there for like days. However, Cindy did not listen to Kylen's father. She kept looking around, and that's when she noticed something near the creek just outside of the campsite. And as she walked closer, the reality of what had happened began to set in. Kylen's father was still begging her to get in the car and drive away and just call the police, for crying out loud. But Cindy's curiosity and her hopes of finding her friend, well, it was just too strong. And so she was dead set on figuring out exactly what had happened. But of course, as she took just a few more steps towards the creek, she realized that maybe she should have listened to Kylen's dad after all, because in that moment, she realized that she was standing over the body of Kylen Schulte. I'll spare you the details because it's quite gruesome, but it was evident that Kylen was deceased and had died from multiple gunshot wounds. And so Cindy sprinted back to her vehicle. She turned around, sped away, and immediately called 911. And when the police arrived shortly after, they also discovered Crystal Turner's body nearby in a very similar state. And so, just like that, the once peaceful little campsite had morphed into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in all of Utah's history. As investigators began to process this awful crime scene by the side of the creek, they had a representative who spoke to the local news and confirmed that both women had been shot multiple times. And that representative also stated that they were actively searching for a suspect and that one of the women's cell phones was also missing from the campsite. But then the representative said something else that actually rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. They said that there was, quote, no ongoing danger to the community. And that didn't make much sense at all. I mean, two women were just brutally murdered at a remote campsite, and there was no information on who did it or why they did it. I mean, for all the public knew, there was still this unknown killer roaming around the woods and streets of Moab, right? No arrests had been made, no clear motive had been established, and the last known messages from Kylen and Crystal suggested that they had been frightened by this strange man lurking around their campsite shortly before they disappeared. And so, how exactly could the police say that the public wasn't at any risk? This was a not so great start to the investigation, and from that point on, it actually seemed like the authorities were chasing leads and theories all over the place in an attempt to win back the public's trust and to get to the bottom of this horrible attack. And so the police began asking around to figure out whether anyone in the area had heard, I don't know, gunshots or screams on the night that the two women went missing. And it turns out that a wedding had actually been taking place at a nearby cabin in the area. But surprisingly, nobody at this wedding remembered hearing anything weird at all. And I only bring this up because it's actually a perfect illustration of a growing trend during this investigation. This was the first of many dead ends that this case would eventually run into. But just because there were dead ends didn't mean there was any progress, or for that matter, any suspects. Someone that police paid attention to was a 27-year-old Moab man whose identity has actually never really been released publicly. Apparently, on August 17th, just one day after Kylen and Crystal were first reported missing, this mystery man was pulled over by law enforcement. The officer who pulled him over described the encounter as deeply unsettling, and that this mystery man's demeanor made him so uneasy that he actually chose not to issue a speeding citation, fearing that taking his eyes off this man, even for just a second to write the ticket, could be too risky. But after Kylen and Crystal were discovered the following day, that bizarre traffic stop now had a whole new layer of suspicion. And so investigators secured a warrant to search the man's vehicle, and they later questioned him at his workplace, which was the Moonflower Co-op. And you might recall that is also where Kylen worked. And so this wild connection made investigators wonder, of course, could this mystery man have been the creepy man that the two women had been talking and texting about? So it turns out that before getting a job at the co-op, the mystery man had apparently visited it quite frequently, and when he was questioned by the authorities, he even admitted to having seen Kylen there. In fact, at one point, he reportedly gave another cashier a single rose in like this weird flirting attempt, I guess. And when questioned about his interactions with Kylen, the man's responses were unclear at best. According to the officer who interviewed him, the man appeared to be dealing with some possible untreated mental health issues, which of course made it difficult to get any clear, consistent answers during questioning. And while this man's name has never been publicly released, several sources that I came across indicated that he had no prior criminal record. Community members also described him as someone who frequently lived out of his vehicle, and I also found sources that claimed some women in the area felt uncomfortable around him because of unwanted attention he allegedly directed towards them. In fact, one local business owner had reportedly asked him to leave her store once due to concerns about his behavior. And so all of this obviously looks very bad, and it was a promising lead at the time, but even though there was this weird overlap between the man and Kylen both working at the Moonflower Co-op, it turns out that employment records later revealed that the man had not started working there until August 16th. After Kylen had already gone missing. And another key aspect to this case that I haven't specifically called out yet is that since Kylen and Crystal were a lesbian couple, a lot of people believed that they were targeted specifically because of their sexuality and might have been the victims of a hate crime. However, when the mystery man was questioned about his views on sexuality and all that stuff, he said that he hadn't even realized that Kylen was married and allegedly insisted that he had no issue with gay people. Now, despite the bizarre traffic stop, the link to Kylen's work, and this man's recorded issues with women, we'll say, he denied any involvement in the killings. He insisted that he wasn't the creepy man. But to make matters even more suspicious, this mystery man wasn't actually able to provide a solid alibi between August 13th and the 15th. Apparently, he could only confirm that he had been sleeping in a spot on a dirt road that was roughly 100 to 300 yards up LaSalle Loop Road from the Moab Overlook, which you might recall just so happened to be along the route that Kylen and Crystal would have passed while returning to their campsite. Officials now realized that they needed to check out this area immediately. When they arrived at the mystery man's campsite, they reportedly found 2 blankets and a jacket that appeared to have a blood stain on it. The jacket was immediately collected as possible evidence, but frustratingly, after testing and forensic analysis, the authorities determined that the apparent blood was not actually connected to the murders of Kylen and Crystal, and the man was ultimately cleared of being involved. And so remember what I said about dead ends? Yeah, but while this mystery man might not have been guilty, the internet was also looking for the real identity of the creepy man, and they had already set their sights on another extremely well-known person of interest. So at the time, many people speculated about a possible link to the famous Gabby Petito case. It's a case that I'm sure most of you have heard about, but if you haven't, I actually did a deep dive on it in a previous video. And so Gabby Petito was a 22-year-old travel blogger who disappeared in August of 2021, right around the same time as Kylin and Crystal. And this happened while she was on a road trip in a camper van with her fiance, Brian Laundrie. Now, tragically, her remains were later found in Wyoming, and of course, her death was ruled a homicide by strangulation. After returning home without Gabby and then becoming the focus of this investigation, Brian Laundrie would go on to dramatically disappear and was eventually found dead in Florida in possession of this strange notebook that indicated he claimed responsibility for Gabby's death. The whole case captured the entire world's attention for months on end, and people have often connected it to Kylin and Crystal's case because the timelines really do overlap in some pretty insane ways. First of all, Gabby and Brian had been driving around Moab in their camper van, and police actually responded to a domestic altercation involving them on August 12th, which was just one day before Kylen and Crystal were last seen. But what really makes things crazy is that when the police finally pulled Gabby and Brian over near Arches National Park, they realized that the actual domestic altercation had occurred in the parking lot of the Moonflower Co-op. And so online rumors quickly fueled theories that Kylen, might have been working at the Moonflower and was the one who witnessed the altercation between Gabby and Brian and ultimately called the police about it. Some folks even wondered whether she had been targeted by Brian as a result. Other people speculated that Brian may have encountered Kylen and Crystal directly. I mean, maybe Brian himself was the creepy man that was lurking around their campsite. Now, there are certainly a lot of strange coincidences between those two cases, but despite the attention that these theories received, investigators found no evidence connecting the murder of Kylen and Crystal to Brian Laundrie. The manager of the Moonflower Co-op later confirmed that Kylen was not actually working at the time of the incident between Brian and Gabby, and it was actually another witness who called 911. But even if there's no connection, it is crystal clear that August of 2021 was a very dark month for the town of Moab. Man, wow. As time ticked by, so many more theories about Kylen and Crystal's murder were floated around the internet. Some have tried to tie the case to the earlier shooting death of Kylen's brother, Mackie. And of course, while it's just tragic that both siblings died as a result of gun violence, there's really nothing else in common that connects the two cases in any real way. Another theory points to drugs, but there's also no indication that the women were involved in anything beyond some occasional marijuana use, and nothing has ever turned up that suggests any drug-related motives. But how about a robbery gone wrong type of scenario? I mean, the missing cell phone might help back up that claim, but nothing else was taken from the campsite. I mean, would someone really do all that damage just for a cell phone? Investigators truly considered every single possibility, but without any additional evidence pointing in the direction of the robbery thing, that wasn't really gonna check out. The theories just kept piling up, but we wouldn't get our next official break in the case until months later in December of 2021, when investigators announced that they were looking for a specific type of ammunition connected to the killings. They revealed that they were trying to track down 9mm Hornady silver bullet casings, which likely became relevant through forensic findings during the autopsies, if you know what I mean. Investigators suggested that the shooter may have intentionally collected spent casings from the scene in an effort to avoid leaving behind any evidence, but even knowing the killer might have been extra careful, investigators were hopeful that any remaining casings could still be a crucial way to find fingerprints or match the ammunition to a possible weapon. anything to get them closer to finding the creepy man. And then 1 month later, in January of 2022, police were able to make a separate announcement that they had narrowed down Kylen and Crystal's official death date to August 14th, which was the day after they were last seen. Their time of death was estimated to be around 11:35 a.m., and the medical examiner reported that while both women died from multiple gunshot wounds, they had not been SA'd despite being discovered looking like partially undressed. And look, it's good that they were finally making some progress in this investigation. It's good that they were starting to learn some more things, but for Kylen and Crystal's loved ones, this still wasn't enough. I mean, they weren't actually any closer to finding the killer. Theories kept flying around. Some people began speculating that the creepy man was actually a man named John Freeman Coles, a convicted sexual predator who had escaped from a Kansas psychiatric facility and was believed to be camping in national forests and national parks across the West. So some people wondered if he had been on like a crime spree or something, but the police never appeared to give this theory much weight. However, investigators did end up scrutinizing Cindy. Remember Cindy, the friend who actually discovered the bodies of Kylen and Crystal? Well, she said that the police seized her phone and treated her like a serious suspect, leaving her worried that she might ultimately be blamed for the crime, even though she never technically was. And while I understand that the police have to do their due diligence, that one didn't really make sense. But as the months went by without a named suspect, the public started to fear that this case might go cold for good. However, everything started to change when well-known television personality Dwayne Dog the Bounty Hunter Chapman announced that he would travel to Moab in early May of 2022 to assist in the investigation. And no, by the way, I am not making that up. Now, if any of you aren't already familiar with Dog the Bounty Hunter, here are 3 important things that you have to know. Number 1, he's a bit of a colorful character. Number 2, he's a little bit controversial. And number 3, he has the worst theme song of all time. I actually do really love that show. But anyways, despite Dog's reputation, he definitely did have some experience tracking down fugitives, right? And so Kylen's father really just appreciated that someone with such a big profile was jumping in and bringing attention to a case that really hadn't gone anywhere yet. Dog reviewed the case, he visited the crime scene, he held some press conferences, he encouraged witnesses to come forward, and he publicized a reward for information that could lead to an arrest. And to be clear, Dog the Bounty Hunter didn't have an official role as part of, law enforcement or the investigation, but he did use his public personality and his investigative team to generate some tips. Ultimately, he didn't really break the case, but I don't know, maybe his presence alone might have been exactly what Moab needed, because right after Dog came to town, the investigation would end up flipping on its head. On May 11th, the authorities announced that they had finally identified a suspect, a real suspect. Adam Pinkowitz was a 45-year-old drifter who had been living out of a vehicle in the Moab area around the same time of the murders. And after investigators looked into him, it became clear that he had some undeniably bizarre connections to Kylen and Crystal. It turns out that years earlier, Adam had apparently worked at the same McDonald's as Crystal, and some former coworkers reportedly described him as bad news and constantly warned others to stay away from him. Detectives also looked into claims that he had expressed hostility towards gay people in the past, which of course brought back the possibility that Kylen and Crystal may have been targeted as part of a hate crime. Hell, Dog the Bounty Hunter even interviewed one coworker who told him that Adam had once referred to Crystal as bossy. And to make matters even more suspicious, Adam left Utah right after the murders. He quit his job without warning. Hell, he never even picked up his last paycheck, and then he just kind of disappeared without a trace. And as if this entire situation couldn't get even more suspicious and alarming, well, when the police held a press conference to name Adam as the primary suspect, they stated that he had allegedly admitted to a friend that he had killed 2 women in Utah. And look, I mean, I guess plenty of people have admitted to crimes that they didn't actually commit, either for attention or just because they're messed up. I don't know. But what made Adam's confession much more believable is that, according to witnesses, he revealed details about the crime that had not been made public. And so when all of this evidence started to stack up, it looked like they had finally found the creepy man. Authorities were convinced that Adam was almost certainly responsible for the brutal shooting deaths of both women and for leaving their bodies near the creek, in their campsite that fateful night. And so investigators were obviously looking to track him down for some questioning. But by the time that Adam Pinkowitz was officially named a suspect, there was one massive problem, and that was that he had been dead for months. Authorities later announced that Adam had taken his own life in late September of 2021, just a few weeks after Kylen and Crystal had been killed. However, neither his body nor his 2007 Toyota was found until the following May, and if investigators were correct about Adam's involvement, the person that they believed was responsible for the deaths of Kylen and Crystal, well, he would never be questioned. He would never stand trial or face any justice for what happened on LaSalle Loop Road. In the months that followed, investigators examined Adam's vehicle for potential evidence and asked the public for assistance in piecing together his whereabouts, during the time. I gotta say, this sounds wrong, but I think you'll know what I mean. This was really an unsatisfying end to this case. Like I said, there was never any justice. And I believe it's this feeling that has left some people convinced that the mystery of who killed Kylen and Crystal hadn't actually been solved. Dog the Bounty Hunter himself even publicly questioned this theory and claimed that several people he spoke with pointed to an entirely different suspect. However, I could not find any source in which he publicly identified who he believed the real killer was. He only suggested that it might not have been Adam and that the police might have named the wrong person. And look, Dog's confusing statements about this just added yet another layer of uncertainty to this already jumbled case, but that also might just be the way that Dog does business. He obviously has a personal interest in proving that he's the only one that actually knows what happened or how to ultimately solve this particular case. But beyond Dog's antics, there is one detail that still continues to bother a lot of people following this case. So the night they went missing, Kylen and Crystal repeatedly talked about the creepy man near their campsite. They also talked about him in the days before their disappearance and ultimate death, but in all of their text messages and their conversations with their friends, they never actually identified this man by name. And remember, if Adam had worked with Crystal to the point where Adam even had an opinion about her, and, if they had been living around Moab for some time, it's pretty hard to understand why neither woman seemed to recognize him. Wouldn't they have said something like, my creepy former coworker is lurking around our campsite, instead of just saying, the creepy man is lurking around the campsite? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we're ever going to get an answer to that question and so many others surrounding this case. After months and months of uncertainty, Kylen's father, Sean Paul, said he felt a little bit of relief once investigators announced that they believed they know who killed Kylen and Crystal. But again, if Adam Pinkowitz was in fact the creepy man, it makes you wonder why this case technically remains open to this day. Kylen and Crystal's loved ones are still looking for the same thing they've wanted from the very beginning: some certainty, some closure. They've heard all of the crazy theories, and now they just want some clear answers about what actually happened out there in the forest. My heart goes out to them, and I really hope that all of you can show them some love in the comments as well. If this is your first time watching me, I hope I earned your subscription. And if you liked this video, YouTube seems to think that you'll like this one next. But most importantly, please keep Kylen and Crystal in your thoughts, and please be safe out there.